The race riots that shook Britain last month were sparked by a fake news story invented by a revenue scalping site in Pakistan. It claimed that the man who'd attacked a children's dance group in Southport was a Muslim illegal immigrant who was under surveillance by MI6. The story was actually one of many that this site churned out, but it contained everything that angers the far right: immigrants, unintegrated Muslims, and an establishment that is too liberal and weak to defend its country's citizens. Before the story was shown to be false, it had spread like wildfire online. The site responsible for this fake news story was exposed by today's guest, Amil Khan. He is a former journalist and the founder of Valent Projects, a startup that uncovers online manipulation campaigns and helps companies and governments counter disinformation attacks. We talk about the work that Valent Projects does, just how pervasive online manipulation is, how it also leads to the radicalisation of certain demographics like older people and young men, and whether governments can successfully regulate social media companies. Although we're entering spooky season, I hope today's talk doesn't frighten you too much. Amil, thank you very much for agreeing to be a guest on the podcast.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for having me.
Finally, after several attempts. I'm going to start by asking, what is your favourite word?
Disestablishmentarianism.
That's a nice one. What is your least favourite word?
Boils.
What is your favourite swear word?
I'm going to go with most used, which is probably, oh, crap.
Are there any notable times in your career where you've used it?
Oh, all the time. All the time. Every juncture, probably. Good and bad.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
A sound or noise that I love. An airplane I'm on touching down.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
The screeching tube. They're all very urban Londoner type sounds, aren't they? I'm realising.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Biryani Fridays.
Nice. What is your favourite book?
It's a book I read recently called Alif the Unseen, which is by an American writer called A. Willow Wilson, who was an American who was in Cairo about the same time as me many years ago, worked at another English language newspaper. I don't think we'd ever met, but she's had an amazing career writing for Marvel, writing books, comics, and she wrote this book, Alif the Unseen, which was a New York Times bestseller, and it's based in a sort of tech fantasy world, an unnamed sort of international city in the Arab world in the Gulf. And the protagonist is a kind of hacker type young guy living on the margins of society, who manages through his hacking to access the world of jinns and spirits, and it's very cool.
Are there any fictional characters who you imagine yourself to be?
Have you watched Lupin?
I haven't. I'm aware of it.
Yeah, I had no idea about this character, this French character who's this sort of gentleman thief. And I don't know, because I haven't read the books, I don't know if it's the character I like or the character in the TV series, this French series, who's really cool but models himself on Lupin. And I'm not a gentleman thief, and I don't live on the margins of society, but I think he's really cool.
Amil, you were the first guest on my last attempt at a podcast. About 7 years ago. And the episode is like lost to time now. But something you said really stuck in my mind, which was that rather than us exporting Western politics to the Middle East, as like everyone believed in the noughties and early teens, you said we were actually importing the Middle East's politics, populism, polarization, conspiracy theories, majoritarian rule, the allure of the strong man. How do you see things now, 7 years on?
Wow, that's really well remembered. Um, and you forget, how you initially thought about things when you first noticed them. It wasn't 7 years ago, it wasn't the first time I noticed it. I suppose I'd sort of made that observation when I'd first come back from the Middle East as a journalist, after working for Reuters. Um, it's thinking about it now, I feel kind of smug that I was proved right. I think at the time, so what would that have been 7 years ago? So 2015, right? When we would have had that conversation.
Uh, I think it was 2017.
Yeah, I think that was at the point where I could make that observation and people would say, okay, yeah, I kind of see where you're going with this. Because if I mentioned it when I first got back from the Middle East, people would have said that's just insane. I remember talking to academics or being in conversations with academics, and they were just like, they had this slightly sort of Eurocentric, Euro cultural superiority point of view. No, that kind of stuff happens in backwards countries and backwards places. It doesn't happen to us. How dare you? And I think now, and people would say, yeah, and I feel like that. We do have majoritarianism, we do have populism, we do have this kind of politics of fear. And I guess the only thing I would add since then is tech enabled majoritarianism and authoritarianism, which is something that I work on now. How is media and the technology around media being leveraged and used and exploited to push those kind of agendas?
I was going to ask, what was it about that environment that led you to start Valent Projects?
There's a specific thing that made me think we needed a company, and I honestly thought I would do anything not to start a company because I had a young family and it just wasn't a good time. I mean, there's no such thing as a good time in your life, I think, to start a company. I think pretty much everyone says that. Definitely wasn't a good time with two young children around the time of COVID. But one of the jobs I'd been doing as an advisor, as a specialist working in the government, was assessing tools or methodologies that could be used to protect UK organizations from disinformation. So I had to assess tools, assess the methodologies, and figure out what could be done about them. And one thing became clear straight off the bat was that social media tools don't correct for bots, and they don't see bots on the one side, so all that sort of metrics isn't really reliable. And then they definitely don't understand that manipulation happens on a kind of process, that there's a stage and then another stage that depends on that, and it's a strategy really. And they just sort of give you the data you just want. How many hashtags do you want? Here you go, here's some hashtags. And these hashtags came from here and these hashtags came from there, or phrases or whatever you're looking for, and that's it. So and COVID was on the horizon, and I thought, no, we need something. I wasn't quite sure. I knew it was going to be a tech-based solution. I knew I needed to understand the issue better. There's the real sort of granularity of the issues to be able to build tech around it, to be able to build a solution. So that's why I thought we're going to see more of this. It's way worse than I thought. I was thinking about the political side and then politics moving into sort of the business side around companies operating abroad. I actually didn't think internally in the UK it would be such an or that all those things would be mixed up, whether it's internally and foreign messaging. There's no barriers between it. So I got a COVID loan and started the company.
It's interesting that you mentioned Lupin. There seems to be a sort of case of detective work, mystery solving in what you're doing. So I wonder why was it that aspect that drew you as well?
Yeah, I think that's just a part of my personality, and that's one of the reasons I was a journalist. I like to um, I like to solve puzzles. I like to understand. I like the puzzles to be real and based on real life, and understand them and get to really disassemble them, put them together, and figure out how it works, and have that sort of sense of satisfaction in that there was this mystery and you got to the bottom of it, which I guess is like Lupin. And that I was an investigative journalist for a big chunk of my career, so that was part of that. And essentially, when I was working in government, it was similar. I was looking at problems that people would have and try and figure them out. And at Valent, yeah, I didn't actually think about it. specifically in those terms, but there's definitely a trend in what kind of work attracts me.
I'm sure you ask this all the time, but can you clear up the definitions of misinformation versus disinformation?
Yeah, it comes up a lot, and there's a good reason for that. It is a confusing setup that people then make worse by just throwing around the phrases depending on whatever they like. So technically, in terms of the most accepted definition by academic researchers, disinformation is when people promote information that they know to be false for some sort of criminal or political, some sort of gain. Misinformation is when people share or produce information that is false, but they don't know it's false. So they just kind of believe it, it attracted them. And then you actually have a third one, which is malinformation, which is true information used in a offensive way. So hacking and leaking or something like that. Now, where this gets messy is that in disinformation, what is normally referred to as a disinformation campaign, you'll get all of those things happening together. So you might have a hack and leak that's then promoted by some kind of malign actor, could be a government, could be a financial or criminal actor. They know it's wrong, but they want to earn money, short stocks, crash an election, whatever. So they know it's wrong. They just are taking advantage of it. And then you'll just have people who will be attracted to that because the narratives appeal to them. So all of those things are happening almost simultaneously. I tend to try and stay away from them for those reasons. We look at as a company, the area that I focus on, because it's obviously a really big area, is manipulation. How is manipulation happening? And manipulation can be mostly it's disinformation, but it can be actually true information. It can be malinformation, and we can just say, yeah, it's in that space. But what we look at, and what I've always looked at from the beginning, is how technically information is manipulated, how psychologically we as people can be manipulated, and people seek to manipulate us. Often, actually, when it's most successful is when there's a mixture of the technological aspect and the psychological aspect. That's when it gets really dangerous.
Something I've sort of been thinking about is, and it kind of relates to what we were talking about with Europe and America importing sort of the politics of the Middle East. Years and years and years ago, in the sort of golden age of security blogging, a guy called Adam Elkus wrote a really good blog post that was about people people find it easier to argue over tools than the ends for which they're used. So at the time of like 2011, 2012, everyone argued about drones, even though drones didn't necessarily throw up any new moral dilemmas that didn't already exist with, say, airplanes or missiles or sort of anything like that. But it was much easier to argue, are drones good or bad, than it was to argue about the war in Afghanistan. Should we continue to be there? How best to wind it down? Should we scale up? It was easier to argue about, are drones good or are drones bad? Something I've always wondered with AI, deepfakes, everything like that, is do they pose any like new threats? Or are they simply heightening issues that already exist in societies like ours? Just the amplification is bigger. So like you've probably seen there being images floating around Twitter and Instagram where it's like sort of an AI generated image of Kamala Harris wearing very scanty clothing, and the caption is usually "This is how she got her start."
Yeah.
Um, and actually, the issue isn't so much the fake image, because doctored and fake images have been around a long time. It actually speaks more to the misogyny in the society than it does necessarily the technology that's around.
Yeah, I guess it's a question of scale or substance. Are we seeing more of it, or is it a move in the line? Is the whole line moving, or are we just going along, getting more of the same along the same line? When it comes to disinformation manipulation, I think it is psychologically, in terms of just humans doing things to each other, it's in the same space. It's not that we're able to do more things for each other, but the scale is a massive issue, and the strength of the impact is a massive issue. With AI, generative AI that you mentioned, the Kamala Harris image, Um, in the old days, a kind of a head stuck on a piece of, another body that was just like really obviously just cut out of a newspaper and stuck together would be troubling, offensive, and all those things. But the reality that you can bring to AI just makes it ickier. Makes people think, oh, that's just, it makes you feel like, I think if you're a normal person, think that's wrong, and therefore has an impact on the victim of it, right? It makes them feel, because if they can just go, well, that's ridiculous, it's my head, and whoever, a model or something, then you just, so that these people are desperate. But that whoever made it is still desperate, but being able to use the tech to get a different psychological reaction from people then makes it, I think, a different thing. So I think the tech does do that. And also, along the same lines, it's the ability to hack our brains, the amount of data that you can get. And I think there's a lot of stuff that people don't put together when it comes to scale. The other day there was a hack on TFL. That's hundreds, if not thousands, of people's traveling data. So everybody focuses on, oh well, they've got the bank details and whatever. Yeah, that's a problem. But they also know a whole bunch of people's daily routines, which is not an easy amount of data to get. On top of that, there are hacks on the NHS. So your health data for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, then you get, and that's all being sold somewhere on the dark web. Like, you can probably go get that. On top of that, if you can then layer publicly available data from, Facebook ads, library or whatever, sort of social media ads, and the kind of data that's available, then you start having really worrying realizations about what it would take to make somebody whose, let's say, mental health is fragile, push them over the edge, or maybe thousands of people whose health is mentally fragile, just a bit over the edge, just a little bit over the edge, enough to be violent or self-harming. That's all becomes very possible if you know that they wake up on a Monday feeling particularly low, and then they go to the doctors or something. So that kind of the scale, I think, there allows bad actors to do things that just were not possible before.
Without giving away your secrets,
Of course.
how how do you approach combating, say, manipulation networks?
Essentially, we use AI to detect how they operate, what they're putting out, how people react to them. And they can be the manipulative type networks where there's somebody with a bit of black market software controlling loads of them, or it can be, now it's moving towards loads of people who might control individual accounts, but they're probably engaging with each other just via WhatsApp or Telegram or something, and sort of doing things at the same time. Also, if they're just sort of people acting. Let's say, for example, we had the race riots in the UK, and you've got a whole people. There is unfortunately going to be a significant percentage of people who want to get back, you want to support it, want to support the rioting and support the guys rioting, and want to justify them. They will be able to, even if they're not coordinating on a Telegram group, they are looking at each other online. They're seeing what other people are doing, seeing narratives form, reacting to them, closed groups, open groups. And all of that activity leaves traces in terms of posting patterns, in terms of narratives and how they evolve. So all of that when with the help of tech, you can see the patterns in that.
What have been your successes?
We have a range of clients from commercial side to more sort of big institutions, and without saying, without risking client confidentiality, I would say that there are organizations on the commercial side, nothing sort of governmental, uh, who are facing the initial stages of disinformation fueled short selling attacks. And we can see that. And that's been really hard to spot for people. So that's been a big issue in the US around banks. It's probably coming here soon. Definitely something that the Bank of England has already warned against, where actors will utilize social media to tank a stock and then make money off it falling. And we've had some successes where we've been able to see that. And that strategy itself is very opportunistic. So they'll publish a few things with huge loads of accounts, thousands of accounts, some piece of actual, let's say, disinformation, just a misappropriated photo or something, and say, oh, this company got caught breaking the law and its stock is going to crash. The government's going to come after them, and it's maybe AI made photo or just a bit stock photo, just completely misrepresented. And those narratives spin up slowly, and they try and get them to catch. And if they don't catch, they go off somewhere else. But if an organization can see them in the early stages and take corrective action, then they could stop them catching. So it's kind of like a bike lock. Like you just have it, and the bike lock itself is not there to guard you against somebody with a massive blowtorch, and who has 3 days to cut through your bike lock. It's there to put them off. And if an organization can see it, it can put them off. And we've had some successes in that are particularly satisfying to see.
You helped expose the company that came up with the fake story that kind of helped spark the riots after the Southport attacks.
I didn't use that example because it's a little bit of it's a selfish satisfaction of having beaten the BBC by a week. At the end of the day, the organization, I say organization is sort of a grand word for what it was. It was a revenue scalping site. It's just a site that's set up by somebody who's quite young, who's just wanting to earn some money out of it. And they have a bit of AI that just finds what's trending online and then pushes it further, just makes something up, pushes it further. So it's not pictures, it's text, it's narratives, really, so it's kind of a version, it's in the same kind of space as us. And people don't realize in whether in journalism and in government and large institutions, it's not generally known that this kind of activity exists. There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages and little websites run by people all over the world just trying to make $20 a month, $30 a month through the gaming of ad revenue infrastructure. And that's the stage we're currently at, where disinformation, online manipulation is kind of going decentralized. It's not necessarily China with hundreds of thousands of such accounts, or Russia. It's just thousands of guys in Bangladesh, in Nigeria, in Vietnam, and elsewhere. And it was particularly satisfying to see, I think, one of the former heads of MI6 say, "Oh, this is definitely Russia." And we are very happy to, if we see it's Russia, we'll be very happy to say, "Oh, that looks like Russia," and we have done in the past. But we were like, "No, it's not." You'd think that because there's the video that happens to be in Russian, but that's a really kind of superficial way of looking at it. So we were able to say, no, this is part of a world, a kind of dark sort of Alif the Unseen, like the book I mentioned, world where people are sort of operating and hustling, and they've got their little money making schemes going on, and AI is being pulled in to help them with that, and it's going to spin off things that cause chaos from time to time. And that is going to happen, and we were able to see that and call it out for that during the time of the riots. And we thought it was important to do that. You could see journalists sort of then jumped on it and sort of started talking about it. We got a lot of people messaging us about it and asking us to talk on media about it. But it was satisfying to know that we'd put an idea in there and sort of opened people's eyes to another type of activity that they'd not been aware of before, that was important to be aware of.
There was a long piece in the FT recently about the politicization of disinformation work in the US. People who are trying to combat it are being sort of vilified online. Some have felt the need to consider personal security. Have you felt any of this working in this area?
We had early on some unwanted attention from people who were linked to Russia via media, the kind of media that they were attached to. This is before the invasion of Ukraine. And it was related to some work we'd done mapping disinformation architecture, these kind of networks in Africa. And they'd been hacked. There's been reporting on it since then that we've seen they were hacked by elements linked to the Russian intelligence services. This Russian aligned outlet got hold of it and then published it. And they published it, and then so you get this kind of Twitter storm of, oh, look at it. And it was totally like they screen grabbed it in a particular way and avoided something and did something else and changed things and whatever. And it was just a bit silly. But the back end of that, which I think people didn't see, which wasn't known, was we got a load of harassment. Like, you know, we got people coming around to the house. We had threatening phone calls. Like I had, you know, all of that stuff. So that was something uh, that I experienced, so I can see what's happening in the US. And to be honest, what's happening in the US looks way worse because what happened in our case, in my case, um, was more just an annoyance, really, more than anything. It's not great to think people coming around to your house and you know trying to harass you and scare your kids and stuff. But at the end of the day, it wasn't really a huge issue. But in the US, you're talking about different actors. We just had like maybe 10, no, maybe less than that, a handful of slightly unhinged people. And I think in the US, you're talking about people who are more unhinged and more of them.
When you mentioned about founding a company, I'm kind of curious what you've found the investment environment to be like. Because with my own experiences in like the VC space, I feel like they are more focused on the alleged opportunities of AI and tech and everything like that than they are dangers.
So you mean that you find that investors are more interested in the opportunity for what you can do with AI rather than looking at
Yeah.
the risks that come with AI? I think that's natural because as investors, they're looking for benefit and the opportunity to earn money out of it. I think that so we're saying there is a problem, but there's a solution. We're offering a solution. Then we do get interest, and we've been very lucky to raise funding and to have investors.
I don't know if you saw it, but Tim Harford wrote an op-ed about misinformation recently, and his overarching argument was that the danger is exaggerated. Um, Yet the exaggeration is creating the conditions for the spread of disinformation because people are questioning even verifiable news.
Yeah.
And reading it, I felt like he got on the wrong end of the stick. But I thought he raised an interesting point about prevalence. He cited a study that found that in 2016, only 6% of all the sites visited by people in America were untrustworthy. However, I've also seen that between a third and half of what of content that people see online is from a disinformation network. So I'm curious, like how prevalent is misinformation?
It's massively prevalent. I think what underpins it really is you can look at data. I think one of these things, you know, people will say, well, there is what I want to see the evidence that disinformation actually changes the result of an election. And you know, that's something that people argue about sometimes. And I think that argument is um, is missing the point slightly because you can if you look at just the time during an election, then you get stuck around well, people who are always going to vote Labour, are they ever going to vote Conservative? And people, you know, so very small differences in margins. But if you take a longer lens and you look 5 years back and you ask, how much does the average voter care about the EU now versus say before 2016? There's been a huge difference. If you or migration or you know boats or whatever. So if you look at it at a longer lens, then misinformation, disinformation, whatever types of manipulation have had an impact on the arguments and the fundamentals of that election that's happening. Whether or not people are being convinced in the 1 month of an election campaign is not really the point. It's like if you look at it 2, 3 years back or 5 years back or whatever, then the nature of that, the arguments on which that election is being based on are due to what's been happening on social media. So I think, I think disinformation, misinformation are huge. I think just looking at, you know, the visitor counts to particular websites is missing the point because it raises the question. I would go beyond that and say, how many people view the BBC as a reliable information source? You know, anymore. And for whatever reason, online or political changes or cultural changes, it's a very big difference in the way in this country, in the UK, how our information environment works compared to, say, 20 or 30 years ago. Trust. What is trust? Who do you trust? What is an information? I get sent stuff from friends and people I know all the time saying, is this reliable? Have you, this is the kind of thing you do. Here, have a look at this. And it'll be endless news outlets you've never heard of. And if I really dug into them, they probably are part of a network. They might just be the guy in wherever trying to earn some money, or they might just be somebody having a laugh, or there might be somebody who really, really believes that particular thing. The point is there's so much of this stuff now that it actually does drown out what is considered reliable news. And to the point, and I would just this would be my kicker on this, is that our traditional media has gone so hard in trying to get the clicks that it is often just as bad. So it's not really dependable in itself, because you often get this if you talk about it in a governmental setting. If you're at a think tank thing or something, they'll say, well, if only people were listening, clicking on the BBC or the Times or blah, blah, whatever, then all these problems would be solved, because they wouldn't be looking at these small unknown websites that might be from Russia. Well, if those websites, news outlets are pushing misogynistic, racist, whatever, just because they think cynically it's going to get them clicks, then there's no huge difference between the two anyway.
Something that I've thought about for a while is I was reading an article about GB News, and there was a comment, I think, by the head of it, and he sort of dismissed that GB News doesn't actually have that many viewers compared to other broadcasters, because most people don't get their news from television. They get it online. But I've always thought that a problem, especially around Brexit and then afterwards, is you can't you can't beat the mainstream channels for disseminating information. And I always found it really interesting that people like Piers Morgan, Andrew Neil, Tim Harwood were sort of at their peak influence-wise when they were on BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and then they try and do these separate ventures that get no traction. And so I do feel like people underestimate the extent to which these little news stories on fake news websites or websites you've never heard of go up the channel, up the pipeline to the credible news sources, and then get disseminated before there's any realization of questioning the veracity of the original story.
Yeah, I think that is what you're speaking to there is the change in the infrastructure of how our information environment works. So how the information flows work, which is something that I've been really interested in for a really long time. So the traditional way it would operate would be that the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, the BBC, whatever, would decide, and the editors of these big institutions in the 60s, 70s, 80s were godlike figures who would decide what thing is worth covering, they're paid for their amazing experience and being able to judge these things. But ultimately it's one man mostly calling the shots and deciding what is going to be in the national discourse. But now you can still be the editor of any of those institutions, but you're more likely, 9 times out of 10, when you're having your editorial meetings, is reacting to something that's come up through networks of little shonky websites that have been testing a narrative and then pushed it up. So talking about the Southport related race riots, two-tier Kia, we could see that. We were monitoring that, and we could see multiple narratives with attendant hashtags and phrases being tested to see what would work. Two-tier Kia was late on the list. They were trying. They didn't even get around to a hashtag on it, but they were trying an argument about the government is paying to protect mosques, but cutting child benefit. So they were trying this whole thing that they're paying to they're giving. It's another example of giving money to all these immigrants. And there was sort of a lot of them were money related because they decided that was a way of getting engagement. And then TK had been around before, and they sort of started using it. And it was the moment, and this is pretty typical. So it's called the breakout scale. When the disinformation goes out from the silo in which it was generated in and breaks out into mainstream media, or several stages, mainstream media being the ultimate aim. And two-tier Kia came to a point where I think a journalist doorstepped a senior policeman and said, "What do you make of the claim that you have two tiers of justice around these riots?" And I think he picked up the guy's microphone and chucked it down. And then it's broken out. That point's broken out, and clearly that journalist was seeing it because they were just looking at social media and they're just covering stuff and it's getting spammed, and they unwittingly probably just became the conduit of that narrative having been tested, being put into the mainstream. And now I think that particular one is just part of our is just that was probably the big success for these kind of manipulative actors over the last few months. There's nothing else that they've really been working on, and they work on hundreds of different like themes or narratives on a weekly basis. And that's the one that's really worked for them, and that's probably earned them their funding.
Harford concedes that although it's not as prevalent, misinformation can still create crises like the riots which followed the Southport attack. And I guess another example could be put to Tim Harford is this Haitian migrants eating the pets story that's gone from the genesis is a Trump supporting woman whose cat went missing, blamed it on Haitian neighbors, even though the cat was apparently in the basement. And then it's gone all the way to the primetime presidential debate, and now real world consequences of schools in Springfield, Ohio having to be closed.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. We could see in the US that there were accounts, networks of pro-Trump accounts, actually putting out video claiming to show migrants, which they were claiming were Haitian migrants, trying to grab pets on the street. I mean, they didn't show them eating it. We didn't look closely enough, to be honest. Didn't want to see any cats getting eaten. But um, I mean, it was it was hilarious because the whole thing was farcical. And then we know that so every now and again when something trends like that, we'll have a look in at the databases we have and say, okay, well that's a sort of right wing American one. Let's have a look what they're saying. And whereas it seems in the mainstream, that's probably a fail for them because in the mainstream people are laughing, and you've got the really well-known news commentators, the Jon Stewarts and others, like really going to town and just ripping it to shreds. But they were trying. It was like a rear guard action. They were like, no, 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 they're out there. Here's the proof of them kidnapping somebody's dog, and it's like some really like low res video of somebody just trying to like grab a cat or a dog. It's just ridiculous. But they'll go at it. They don't quit easy.
Something that's connected to that and concerned me for a while is the radicalisation of older people. Amil Rajan interviewed Sir John Major last week, and he asked him about the future of the Tory party. Major said he was very hopeful that the party would move back to the centre because its backbone was made up of sort of good, decent WI or Rotary Club attending people who believe in the rule of law and ethical behavior and sensible politics. But I also read today that around half of Tory party members watch GB News, which puts out, shall we say, a misinformed picture about issues like race and gender. And from my own experience in the Tory party over a decade ago, I would talk to very nice, very pleasant older people, activists, who would repeat without question extreme content that they'd seen on Facebook or Twitter. I'm sure you've seen that there are moves in Australia to ban social media for under 16s, but I often sort of wonder if actually it should be banned for over 65s.
There's a good argument for that. There definitely is. I mean, I've heard some really nasty views. There's I don't have a coherent thought on how and why this has happened really, but it is definitely something that I've noticed because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, older people would say, "Oh, why are these younger people online all the time? What's wrong with them?" And now often you'll see the numbers as to who uses Facebook particularly the most, and it's older people. They're on it a lot. And like in any case, regardless of how old you are, if you are on a curated network that's constantly feeding you content, it's going to color how you see the world. And then you get the psychological aspect of that, which we know, which there's been lots of studies on, where they could get you on one particular thing that you are unhappy about. So your gateway issue, and your gateway issue could be then probably speaks to the fact of being older, that um, you think the world has gotten a lot worse since you were younger because people's ethics have gone down, their morality's gone down the pan, whatever. That's as old as the hills, right? Like old people complaining about that sort of thing, or older people complaining about that. But it's the ability to link that to something else, and link that frustration about prices rising or whatever it is, and say, well, that's because of migrants, or it's because of this, or it's because of that. And there's definitely concerted efforts to do that. And they are succeeding because there are things that people, I've seen multiple communities, like different communities, like you could say older middle class white communities to British Muslim communities, who will now take a really strong position on something which they didn't really have a view on, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But now it's like an existential issue. What's interesting is when different communities that are on different ends of the social spectrum start having really strong views about the same thing. So trans rights. So you can be a British, say, let's say, very stereotypically, just for the sake of argument, you can have a working class, older British Muslim, and you can have a middle or upper middle class white home counties over 65 person, and they both agree on the one thing, which is that they don't want twerking models, trans models in their grandkids' schools. It's a thing. It's like they've both clearly been targeted by that idea, and it's really animated them, and they've become really strident about it. Whereas the same people, if you've known them for a long time, if they're your friends or family, would not have even imagined that that was an issue. It wouldn't be on their radar, but it definitely is on their radar now. Is it because they've met physically and known that there are people out there who are agitating to go into primary schools and start twerking? No, they've not met anybody who's done that or wants to do that, but they're convinced that it happens. So you then do wonder for them being targeted by that, because they do see different content. That's just the nature of how social media platforms work. So so yeah, I would say that is a concern, but also I have seen reports that young men are more likely to be radicalized by social media, the whole sort of Andrew Tate phenomenon. So not exclusively older people, but maybe if we dig into what the factors are that make people vulnerable, then we might find something common.
It's interesting when you mention trans rights. Like, whenever I get into a discussion about this, something that I always point out is after 2012, after Putin got re-elected as president, he made a deliberate decision to make trans issues a thing, a wedge issue. And then there have also chat logs of neo-Nazis and neo-Nazi chat rooms where it's been explicitly stated that questioning trans people is part of a strategy to chip away at LGBT rights generally. Because, sort of, I guess, cis gay white men are accepted in Britain, America, Europe, that they can't be attacked directly. But if you can start with trans people as a wedge, you
Yeah,
can slowly move it. So seeing in America, and then I also think starting to see it in Britain slightly on the right, of first it starts with trans people, then it's drag queens, then
yeah,
it's teaching children about gay issues, and then it's gay people as groomers, and very
yeah.
slowly like that it's just generally shifted along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a strategy. That's an influence strategy that's been around for a really long time, and it's linked. It's a very famous book about that was used in the world of advertising. I think Caldini, and it's about how influence and persuasion work. And it was used in the advertising industry. So if you want to shift people on a big issue that most people are opposed to, then you start way down the line and you get them on an issue they will agree on. So you can see multiple examples of that. The one you gave there is a really good one. But let's say let's say the same one that we've similar one, in parallel that we've seen is about British Muslims and Islam as a religion in public life, in society in the UK. So the people who want to attack Muslims or attack the idea of Muslims in public life in society, they don't say we need to remove these Muslims because we don't like their religion. That's not gonna work. Because there are very few people who'll get up and say, yeah, that sounds really good. So what you do is you say we don't want Sharia in the UK, and it's a really cunning strategy because the people who oppose you often will turn around and say, well, let's talk about the Sharia. It's not the way you're promoting it. It's different. It's not that. It's personal, or it's and you're like totally falling into that trap of then having a conversation that they want to have. And you'll see that their then communication strategies are all about the Sharia and in a particular way, and whatever, instead of just saying, no, we know where you're going with this. Is this really, and is this really a sincere discussion that you're having here, or is it part of an influence strategy? So it's the same with if we're, any of the example that you gave is what trans rights is just, it's become a phenomenon in public discourse in Western countries in a way that I've never heard before at all growing up, or up to my 20s and 30s. Like, it's just not an issue, but there's been definitely an issue to make it a wedge issue, as you said. And when you look at the kind of networks that are putting it out, often we track at work 8 hard right networks, and it's something that comes up all the time. And those networks are not organic, the ones that we track. That's, without a doubt. We haven't looked into who's behind them, but they're definitely not organic. And they hit about 6 million people in the UK on a regular basis.
I also find that it's a, as you said, one of those gateway issues where, I mean, there are several people, without naming names, who are women, and I guess on most things are on the left of politics, but have really leaned into trans people as a threat to women.
Yeah.
And through that, by focusing on that and being very obsessed with that, find themselves moving authoritarian on other issues. So yeah, so I mean that's something else that worries me about trans, right? Just that it is that gateway of just people moving from, I guess, worrying about trans people who are like a fraction of the population into this darker authoritarian space.
That's the linking of it to something else. So if you asked the same people 10 or 15 years ago and you talked about trans people, they'd probably just shrug their shoulders, and just be like, yeah, of course they don't want to, you shouldn't have anybody of any type being attacked in the streets, just for being what they are. Now, if you have that discussion, it'd be like, well, are they bringing it on themselves by twerking in schools? And that's because of what's happened in the information environment. That's the manipulation that's happened around that. But I think it works because um, so if you take COVID, for example, it's tapped into something. This is almost a truism that is that is sincerely felt by that group. So with COVID, and if you think of anti-vax, it taps into a sense of mistrust of the pharmaceutical industry, particularly. And if you sit with somebody who really believes that and has believed it for a really long time and isn't just being radicalized in the last year or so, they will tell you specific examples of terrible things that pharmaceutical companies have done, which you can look up and actually happened, without a doubt. So there's a basis for their belief. But where an actor comes in and goes, okay, that's my hook. I'm going to use that, and then I'm going to build out of it a whole worldview of mistrust and paranoia and fear, then we end up in very scary places.
I interviewed Damien Collins, who was the chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee and looked into fake news, Cambridge Analytica, and he also helped see through the passage of the Online Safety Act. I asked him how best can governments rein in someone like Musk, who seems like there are lots of social media barons who own these platforms, like, say, Facebook, Instagram, who don't necessarily publicly express their political preferences. Whereas with Musk, it's someone who has a platform and is using it to put out extreme views. Damien's view was that the Online Safety Act, the effects of it will start to be felt next year in terms of how best to rein in the behavior of someone like Musk in spreading disinformation. Do you think that's sufficient? Should there be additional regulations?
I haven't actually looked in detail at the online safety. I've looked at the sort of top lines, but I haven't read the text of it. I think in my overarching principle is that I think whether you are pro regulation or not, in this country right now, the regulation is relatively meaningless. Whether you're for it or against it, there's only so much you're going to do as a nation of 16 million people that's going to have any sort of meaning on the scale of a big multinational company with billions of people on their platforms. Obviously, the EU has more ability to do that. The US and China have more ability to do that, but we don't really. So I think what I can speak to what we focus on, and that's not, as I was saying, the intent and is this particular narrative right or wrong, or what's their position. It's the infrastructure behind manipulation. And on that, even on that, I would definitely be pro regulation on that. The social media platforms themselves have very clear rules about it and take action on it. Facebook is constantly shutting down such networks, and I think X and Twitter do too. But if we had regulation on that in the UK, what difference would that really make? Because the organizations, that's something they are motivated to do something about, and it just costs them to. As far as I understand, it costs so much money to do that because there's so much of this kind of activity. So they're only going to spend a certain amount of money on it. The UK government can't say, well, no, you have to spend, more money than you make in revenue to do this. That's not going to happen. They don't have any levers to make that happen. So I'm not hopeful on regulation. I don't really have an answer as to what it should be, but that's why we do what we do, which is to help on the downrange side. If you're facing this stuff, how do you outcompete it? That's probably your best bet. Waiting for a law or waiting for somebody to take down accounts isn't the most effective way of doing that.
I guess my last question would be, do you have any tips for listeners about how best to recognize or be vigilant about manipulation?
I said this once, I think on a panel discussion, and everyone said, oh, it's a bit of a cop-out. But actually, I would double down on it because I've been looking at some psychological studies around this and how disinformation works and manipulation. If you really find yourself violently agreeing with something, you're probably being manipulated. That's what we should do. That's probably the most effective way, because that's what it's designed to do. For us, if we did that at scale, we would be way better at making it less powerful, defanging it a bit by just being like, that doesn't sound right. And I have seen a few examples where that happens in particular silos of communities where where the disinformation just stopped working because people said, oh, yeah, you're pressing our buttons and we know our buttons are being pressed, so we're not interested.
Amil, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
If you weren't too frightened by mine and Amil's talk, please rate the show and comment on whichever platform you're listening on. If you'd like to buy any of the books mentioned and support independent stores in the UK, check out the Strategy Aaron bookshop page in the show notes. And speaking of misinformation in the far right, check out my friend Andrew Nocty's article on J.D. Vance, which is also linked in the show notes. Hope you all tune in again next week.